Jason Alan Thornburg, born August 27, 1980, a native of Cerritos, California, was the subject of a high-profile criminal prosecution in Tarrant County, Texas. Following a multi-day trial and careful presentation of evidence by the prosecution, a jury found Thornburg guilty of multiple counts of capital murder for the deaths of 3 individuals: David Luares, age 42, Lauren Phillips, age 34, and Maricruz Mates, age 33. The criminal case drew intense public and media attention due to the brutality alleged in the incidents and the manner in which the bodies were handled after the killings. Prosecutors asserted that the killings were premeditated, deliberate, and accompanied by aggravating circumstances that met the legal threshold for capital punishment under Texas law. During the course of proceedings, the state introduced forensic evidence, witness testimony, and investigative findings that prosecutors argued established both Thornburg's guilt and the calculated nature of his conduct. Investigators presented evidence relating to the killings themselves and to subsequent efforts to conceal and dispose of remains. In response, Thornburg's defense pursued an insanity, mental disease theory, and sought to introduce evidence concerning his mental state, including claims of severe psychological disturbance and religiously tinged delusions. The defense also referenced alleged developmental and neurological factors in Thornburg's background that they argued affected his capacity. After hearing testimony from mental health experts on both sides and reviewing the full evidentiary record, the jury and the court concluded that Thornburg was legally competent and criminally responsible for his actions. By late November 2024, the jury returned a guilty verdict on the capital charges, finding that the elements required for conviction had been met beyond a reasonable doubt. In the punishment phase that followed, the same jury determined that the aggravating facts of the offenses warranted the most severe penalty available. On December 4, 2024, the court formally imposed the sentence of death. The judgment reflects the jury's determination that the murders were aggravated by factors, most notably the calculated nature of the killings and the subsequent dismemberment and efforts to conceal the victims. That made the case eligible for capital sentencing under Texas statutes. In addition to the 3 capital convictions for which Thornburg was sentenced to death, prosecutors secured admissions or extracted statements tying Thornburg to other suspicious incidents under investigation, including the long unresolved disappearance of Tanya Begay, 2017, and the death of Mark Jewell, 2021. While those additional allegations were described during the trial and in ancillary filings, the principal convictions that produced the death sentence were the 3 counts associated with Luares, Phillips, and Mathis. Following sentencing, Thornburg was remanded to the custody of the Texas Department of Criminal Justice and assigned to the Alan B. Polunsky Unit, Texas's designated death row facility, where inmates sentenced to death are held pending the exhaustion of direct appeals and post-conviction proceedings. The judgment and sentence trigger an automatic and assured series of appellate and post-conviction review steps under state and federal law. Thornburg is entitled to pursue appeals, seek habeas relief, and present additional legal challenges to his conviction and sentence through the established processes. The case prompted sharp public debate about culpability, mental illness defenses, and the appropriate scope of capital punishment. Victims' families and the prosecuting authorities emphasized the need for accountability and for recognition of the magnitude of loss endured by surviving relatives. Defense advocates and some mental health observers raised questions about the role of psychiatric illness and the fairness of imposing the death penalty where deep psychological disturbance was argued to be present. Regardless of those policy discussions, the court's sentence, rendered following jury findings and statutory procedures, reflects the legal conclusion that Thornburg's acts met the standards for capital punishment as applied in that jurisdiction. Finally, the sentencing order included provisions for restitution and for formal notifications to the families of the victims. And the court record documents the prosecution's commitment to continuing to work with law enforcement to resolve outstanding questions connected to other alleged incidents. Thornburg's conviction and death sentence stand as the culmination of a lengthy investigation and prosecution, and they will be the subject of detailed appellate scrutiny in the months and years to come.
Your Honor, members of the court, and to the families of the victims who sit here today, I stand before you not as a man trying to escape judgment, not as a defendant pleading for mercy, but as someone who knows that every word I speak now cannot erase what has already been done. I have no illusions that my confession will ease the grief that I have caused, or that my explanations, however lengthy or precise, will ever bring back the lives I have taken. Still, I speak because it is the only thing left for me to do, to acknowledge with full clarity and without disguise that the weight of guilt rests on me alone. From the beginning, I want this courtroom to understand something. I am not here to deny, to dispute, or to play the games that many accused men have played before. I killed. I ended human lives. I watched blood spill. I felt breath leave bodies, and I stood over the silence that follows death. I will not insult this court by pretending otherwise. Every report you have read, every piece of evidence you have examined, every charred remnant, and every broken bone you have documented, they all trace back to my actions, my hands, my choices. There is no one else to name, no mysterious accomplice to hide behind. I am the beginning and the end of this trail of destruction. I know the ritual of trials. Defendants sit here, sometimes stoic, sometimes trembling, waiting for lawyers to spin words into shields. But I never came here expecting a shield. What shield could there possibly be against the truth of what I did? You cannot erase bodies from the ground with clever arguments. You cannot stitch flesh back together with technicalities. I stand here guilty in ways that the law defines and in ways that morality condemns. And though you may one day carry out the sentence of death upon me, I have already carried a kind of death inside myself long before these proceedings began. People have asked me, both in the silence of interrogation rooms and in the glare of cameras, why I chose to admit so much. Why not deny? Why not remain silent and leave the burden of proof entirely on the state? My answer is simple. Denial is for those who still cling to hope of freedom, or for those who cannot face themselves. I am not free, not inside, not in any sense of the word, and I have already faced the reflection of who I am too many times to pretend I am anyone else. Denial would be another lie layered on top of the rotting heap of my deeds, and I no longer have the strength or the desire to live inside lies. When I first sat in this courtroom, I looked around and felt the weight of eyes upon me. The prosecutor's eyes, sharp with purpose, the defense's eyes, searching for fragments of strategy, the family's eyes, heavy with hatred and unbearable grief. I felt them all, and I did not flinch, not because I am immune, but because I know I deserve every ounce of that gaze. Those eyes remind me again and again that the people I killed were not phantoms in my mind, not nameless figures in a nightmare, but living souls with families, voices, dreams, and faces that once carried laughter. I stole them from the world. I cannot give them back. What I can give, the only thing left in my possession, is the naked truth. And the truth is not flattering. It is not redemptive. It is not shaped to win sympathy. It is ugly, brutal, and cold. It is the truth of a man who believed in twisted ideas, who gave himself permission to do things no person should ever do, who crossed the line that separates thought from action and never turned back. It is the truth of someone who will be remembered not for kindness or creation, but for the cruelty of his destruction. As I speak now, I know that my words may sound calculated, as if I were rehearsing for pity or performing a role for history. But I assure you, there is no performance here. I have spoken these words to myself countless times, alone in the cell where silence and darkness stretch endlessly. The words are all I have. They are my mirror, my punishment, and my only act of honesty. Each time I repeat them, they cut deeper. Each time I form them, they strip away another layer of denial, until nothing is left but raw, unadorned guilt. I have heard people describe killers like me as monsters, and perhaps that word fits. A monster is not bound by the ordinary limits of empathy. A monster sees others not as equals, but as pieces, as opportunities, as obstacles. That was me. But I would add this: monsters do not rise from nowhere. They are shaped, twisted, and built piece by piece over time. I will not use this truth as an excuse, but I will not hide it either. There were forces in my life, internal and external, that carved away my humanity until very little remained. And when the moment came, when I crossed the threshold into killing, it was almost as though it had been waiting all along. Even as I say this, I want to be clear. I am not offering excuses. Excuses suggest that responsibility can be shifted, diluted, or erased. I do not believe that. Responsibility cannot be transferred. It clings to me like smoke clings to fire. What I am doing here is not shifting blame, but mapping the terrain of my own ruin, showing how the path unfolded. If I tell you about my darkness, it is not to justify it, but to make sure you understand that it was real, and it was mine alone. So let me return to the simplest truth. I killed. I destroyed 3 lives, directly, and more indirectly, through the grief and torment inflicted on their families. I brought chaos into this community, left ashes where there should have been warmth, left silence where there should have been voices. That is what I did, and no sentence of this court, no execution date set upon me, can balance that equation. Death will come for me, yes, but it will not resurrect them. Death will silence me, but it will not heal the wounds I carved. And yet, despite that imbalance, I accept the judgment of this court. I accept the punishment because I know it is the only answer the law has, and it is more mercy than I ever gave to the people who trusted me enough to let me near them. The families deserve a verdict, a sentence, a conclusion. They deserve to see me fall as I made their loved ones fall. And though I cannot undo what I did, I will not resist the justice that follows me now. This is my opening statement, my unvarnished truth. You will hear details, you will hear explanations, you will hear the cold mechanics of how I chose, how I acted, how I disposed. But never forget, beneath every word is this foundation. I am guilty, not guilty in the technical sense alone, but guilty in the core of my being. Guilty when I wake, guilty when I sleep, guilty when I sit here before you. This guilt is not a cloak I can remove. It is fused into my skin. And as long as I breathe, it will breathe with me. So I will speak, not because I expect forgiveness, but because silence would be yet another cowardice, and I have run out of places to hide from myself. Your Honor, when I speak of my past, I do not do so to erase the weight of my crimes, or to ask you to see me as less guilty. I stand guilty regardless of what came before, but I believe you cannot understand the shape of a man unless you see the mold from which he was formed. My hands carried out the killings, yes, but those same hands were once the hands of a child, shaped by influences, experiences, and distortions that twisted them long before they ever drew blood. If I am to confess fully, I must confess not only to the acts themselves, but to the crooked roots that grew into the tree of my violence. I was born on August 27th, 1980, in Cerritos, California. At first glance, my childhood may have seemed unremarkable. Another boy in another neighborhood, attending school, riding bicycles, sitting in classrooms. But beneath that surface, there were cracks forming early. I was not like other children, or at least I did not feel like them. While others played easily, laughed easily, connected without thought, I felt a separation, an invisible glass wall between me and the rest of the world. It wasn't merely shyness or introversion. It was a sense of disconnection so deep it seemed I was walking among people while belonging to some other order of existence entirely. At home, there were expectations, pressures, and failures that I carried like stones in my pockets. My family was not cruel, not in ways that you might imagine, but there was a distance that echoed the distance I already felt inside myself. Conversations were often thin, emotions restrained, and discipline more about silence than guidance. I learned early to keep much of myself locked away. The few times I tried to express the storms that gathered in me, I was met with incomprehension or dismissal. "You'll grow out of it," they said. "You're just sensitive." But I didn't grow out of it. Instead, the storm grew with me. School did not offer refuge. I was the boy who lingered at the edges of groups, the one whose eyes drifted elsewhere, whose attention slipped into obsessions that teachers could not understand. While others memorized lessons, I memorized darker things: the shapes of fire, the patterns of destruction, the way animals froze in fear. When I was young, I experimented with small cruelties, things that would seem trivial to outsiders, but that I now recognize as the seedlings of something more malignant. A lizard caught and held too tightly, a bird whose wing I clipped just to see how it would respond. These were not games of curiosity, they were rehearsals for dominance, explorations of power over weaker things. Layered upon this foundation came religion. In my youth, I was exposed to teachings that painted the world in sharp contrasts: good and evil, heaven and hell, salvation and damnation. At first I listened as anyone would, but as I grew older, the words seeped into me in ways they were not meant to. What others heard as metaphors, I took as literal commands. Where others sought comfort, I found obsession. Fire was not just a symbol of cleansing, it was, in my mind, a tool that God Himself had placed in the world to separate the pure from the impure. Sacrifice was not just a story of the past, it was a model for the present. My thoughts twisted further during adolescence. I began to believe I had been chosen, not in the comforting sense of being loved by a higher power, but in the isolating sense of being marked for a dark duty. The more alone I felt, the more this belief hardened. I looked at people and wondered if they were real in the same way I was real. Their laughter, their movements seemed like performances, empty gestures in a world of shadows. I began to view myself as standing apart, perhaps cursed, perhaps destined, but certainly different. And when you believe you are fundamentally different from everyone else, it becomes easier, far too easy, to step outside the moral boundaries that hold society together. By the time I reached adulthood, the combination of detachment, obsession, and distorted faith had made me into a vessel already primed for violence. I did not wake one day and decide to kill. It was a slow accretion of thoughts, compulsions, and rituals that built over years, until killing felt less like a choice, and more like the natural continuation of what had always been inside me. Every failure in my personal life, every broken relationship, every job lost or abandoned, every lonely night, staring at the ceiling, they all fed into the same well. The conviction that ordinary life was not meant for me, that my path lay elsewhere, that I was to be an agent of destruction rather than a participant in community. There were warning signs, there always are, outbursts that could not be explained, strange statements that unsettled those who heard them, obsessions with fire and sacrifice that alarmed a few who glimpsed them. But in a world busy with its own troubles, my darkness slipped by, mostly unnoticed. People dismissed me as odd, eccentric, unstable perhaps, but not dangerous. They saw the surface, a man who moved from place to place, who kept to himself, who spoke of God in ways that seemed strange, but not immediately threatening. They did not see the furnace burning underneath. Religion, for me, was no longer about salvation. It had become about purification through destruction. I read passages and twisted them until they spoke of fire as destiny, of blood as offering, of death as passage. I convinced myself that to kill was not merely to end a life, but to fulfill a cosmic requirement. When you believe you are acting under the authority of something greater than yourself, when you convince yourself that murder is not just personal, but divine, then you erase the final barriers that would otherwise stop you. That is what happened to me. I erased my own boundaries. But I must emphasize again, these influences shaped me, yes, but they do not absolve me. Many people are raised in strict households. Many wrestle with feelings of alienation. Many misinterpret religious texts. They do not all become killers. I did. The fault line runs through me. If I were a piece of flawed machinery, perhaps you could say the design was faulty, but the wreckage I left behind is still wreckage, and I am still the one who caused it. There were moments, brief flashes, when I could almost see the wrongness of my path. A look from a stranger that pierced me, a dream where I saw faces accusing me, a sudden pang of guilt after a violent thought. But each time, instead of steering me back, those moments only deepened my conviction that I was different. I told myself, guilt is just weakness. Fear is just resistance to the duty I have been assigned. And so I hardened more and more until the part of me that could connect to others had withered to almost nothing. When the killings finally began, they did not spring out of nowhere. They were the inevitable flowering of a poisoned seed, planted long ago. Each strike, each flame, each dismemberment was an echo of the obsessions and distortions that had lived in me since childhood. If you want to understand why I did what I did, you must look here, not to excuse, but to see the lineage of darkness that ran through my life. I am not proud of this background. I do not present it to earn sympathy. I present it because a confession that does not include the roots is incomplete. I cannot ask the families of the victims to forgive me. Forgiveness is theirs to withhold forever. But I can, at the very least, strip away the mask and show the full picture. The boy who was disconnected. The youth who was obsessed. The man who believed himself chosen for destruction. That is the story behind the crimes. That is the soil from which my guilt grew. And so when you see me now, you see not only the killer who acted in the recent past, but the culmination of decades of isolation, obsession, and delusion. You see the result of a long journey away from humanity, a journey that began in childhood and ended in blood. That is my background. That is my influence. That is the truth I carry with me into judgment. When people ask how I chose them, they look for a single explanation, a pattern so neat you can diagram it, a motive so obvious you can point at it and shake your head. But it was not a single thing. It was an accumulation of small judgments, instincts trained over years, and a sequence of rationalizations that made the impossible seem permissible. I could tell you the mundane places where I found them, bars, bus stops, late-night streets, but the truth is that the choice always came from inside me, long before I spoke to anyone. The process that led one human being to be marked and another to be ignored was quiet, precise, and poisonous. It looked, to me, like method. To everyone else, it was murder. First, there was recognition. I learned to watch people the way a collector watches for the rare piece to add to a set. I did not see the world in faces. I saw it in opportunity. A man alone under a streetlight struck me differently than a group laughing on a sidewalk. A young person who accepted an invitation without suspicion was more visible to me than someone with a steady companion. These were not moral judgments. They were metrics. I would scan the environment, and my mind would score potential targets along a handful of criteria: accessibility, isolation, surrender to trust, and what I later told myself, their disposability. Accessibility meant how easily I could bring them into my space without drawing attention. A late-night walker, a person accepting a ride, someone who needed help, these were openings. Isolation was about the odds that no one would notice quickly enough to intervene. The more alone they were, the more the calculus favored them. Surrender to trust was crucial. People who accepted a drink, who smiled and agreed to words, who allowed small kindnesses because loneliness had made them hopeful. They let their guard down, and that moment made them vulnerable. Finally, disposability was the most chilling of my internal metrics, the degree to which I believed they would be missed, overlooked, or forgotten. In my worst thinking, I assigned less value to those I perceived as marginal, and that assignment made it easier to cross the boundary into action. The cruelty of the selection process is that it felt cold and clinical to me. I trained myself to notice habits, to predict responses. I learned that a certain tone in a voice signaled compliance, that a particular posture suggested reticence to resist. Often, it was not a conscious search for the perfect victim. Rather, it was a quiet filter in my perception, an automatic sifting where most people were simply background, and a small number were objects that my mind marked for approach. Part of my distorted logic involved cataloguing. I did not simply think, this person is easy. I would sometimes note details in my head, age range, clothing, whether they looked tired, if they were carrying bags, the way their eyes tracked movement. I told myself that this was about planning and control. Planning, after all, creates predictability. Predictability reduces risk. My obsession with reducing risk was not a rational safety concern for others. It was a selfish calculation to ensure my actions remained hidden. In the night of it, the cataloguing looked like work. I convinced myself there was nobility in doing something efficiently. If one was going to act, then one should do it with precision. I can hear how that reads now. A man trivializing human life by treating it as data. That is exactly what it was. Data. Rows in a spreadsheet my mind produced. Each row represented a person with a name I did not bother to learn before the act. What eased the horror further for me was the practice of labeling. Labels simplify. Once someone is labeled transient, isolated, or invisible, their full existence recedes behind a shorthand that makes harming them mentally easier. Dehumanization was not a theory for me. It was a method. Another element of this distorted reasoning was the narrative I told myself about mercy or release. I found it useful to create a story where the act was framed as ending suffering. In the private logic, this supposed mercy justified selection. If someone seemed trapped in a life of neglect, if they looked hopeless in a way my own alienation mistook for despair, then I could invent a moral cover, that I was delivering them from pain. That idea was profoundly dishonest. It served merely to quiet the small protests in me and to construct a flimsy ethical scaffold to lean on. It should be clear, making such narratives did not make my acts merciful, nor did it lessen their brutality. It only made the transition from thought to deed easier for me. The way I approached people was rehearsed. There was a choreography I followed, honed by observation and repeated in the quiet spaces of my mind. I would begin with an ordinary human gesture, a question about directions, an offer to help carry a bag, an invitation to a drink, something that fit the moment and would not immediately alarm. The opening line varied because context varied, but the structural purpose remained constant. I wanted to lower vigilance. That initial interaction had to appear ordinary, otherwise the chance for escalation and discovery increased. Once inside the private space, I created a car, a motel room, an apartment. The dynamic changed. I used small acts of attention to foster trust, listening, appearing sympathetic, offering a simple comfort. I do not deny the manipulative cruelty of that intimacy. It was a ruse, a contrived closeness designed to make resistance less likely. People underestimate how important the perception of safety is in preventing someone from defending themselves. When I offered a cigarette and a seat, that cigarette and that seat were not gestures of care. They were tools. Psychological safety often feels stronger than physical strength. That is a fact I exploited. Control was always the aim. My distorted logic prized control because it meant predictability, and with predictability I could plan the disappearance. Sometimes my method involved drugs or alcohol. Sometimes it involved the element of surprise. The mechanics changed, but the underlying calculation did not. Reduce resistance, shorten the window for intervention, and create after that minimized detection. I will not detail the mechanics here because I refuse to provide a how-to for anyone with dangerous inclinations. My confessions will be honest, but they will not instruct. After the act, the selection logic extended into disposal and cover-up. If someone was chosen because they were less likely to be missed, then every subsequent decision aimed to preserve that invisibility. I thought in terms of timelines. How long would it take before someone noticed? What routes were less monitored? Which locations were remote enough to delay discovery? You can call this cold calculus, and you would be right. It is the cognitive trace of someone who has reduced human beings to variables and outcomes. There was also a darker sibling to selection, curiosity. Some people I approached because I wanted to test something inside myself. Would the act change me? Would it confirm the hollow inside? These were experiments in a laboratory that had no ethical constraints, and the victims were the unwitting subjects. That cruelty is almost unbearable to admit. I framed people's deaths as personal experiments. Scientific language masked monstrous intent, but at heart it was the same old desire for control. Another distortion was the progressive nature of selection. Initially, there may have been hesitation, a human hesitation that might have stopped someone else. But repetition hardened me. Each time the action succeeded without immediate consequences, the threshold to act again lowered. The mental barriers eroded incrementally. What at first was a choice became, over time, a pattern, an automaticity where selection became almost reflexive. My mind developed heuristics. If a person met certain criteria, act. Actness replaced deliberation. That slippery slope explains part of how a handful of actions multiplied into a pattern of recurring behavior. I also relied on the social invisibility of certain lives. If I could choose someone who, in my perverse estimation, occupied a marginal social position, someone estranged from family, someone transient, someone with addictions, I told myself that their loss would ripple less loudly. That was self-serving comfort masquerading as strategy. It was a cruel arithmetic of human worth that I applied to avoid the piercing reality of what I was doing. In hindsight, it is a coward's logic. The easier the victim was to mourn in public, the less likely my crimes would trigger an immediate search. A further layer of my distorted logic concerned the illusion of inevitability. Once I committed the first act and rationalized it, I began to see the path forward as inevitable. The selection of subsequent victims felt, in my mind, less like new crimes and more like completing a project already underway. That sense of inevitability is the cognitive trap that traps many who repeat destructive acts, the belief that because one has acted once, one is compelled to act again. I found ways to make the future look like the past, normalizing the abnormal. I must stress that none of these rationalizations excuse what I did. They explain, perhaps, but they do not absolve. The court needs explanation so that the public can understand the mechanisms of prediction and prevention. The families deserve explanation so that the acts do not remain inexplicable horrors. But explanation is not forgiveness. My mind's ability to manufacture justifications is a measure of how disturbed it became, not a reason to soften judgment. Let me address the moral contortions directly. In the spaces of my thinking, I often rehearsed counter-arguments to imagined critics. I would pose their questions and answer them, erecting a scaffold of logic that made my actions seem, for a time, less monstrous. They were not valued by society, I would say to myself. They would not be missed. The world is harsh. I am only pruning it. These are self-deceptions. They were also cognitive strategies to reduce dissonance. Psychology has names for these mechanisms: dehumanization, minimization, moral disengagement, and I use them reflexively. Identifying them now is not an attempt to escape blame, but an admission of how thoroughly I rearranged my moral furniture to make space for killing. You may wonder if I ever felt remorse in the selection phase. The answer is complicated. There were moments, brief, sharp, when the gravity of what I contemplated struck me. A flash of another life, a possible child, a mother who would never see a call returned. Those moments sometimes froze me. But the next rationalization would come. Inconvenience, ineffability, destiny. My desire to proceed overruled those glances of conscience. Over time, the remorse dulled. That dulling is part of what made further selections possible. Each rationalization dulled conscience a little more, and each act reinforced the ease of the next. Context matters too. I did not operate in a vacuum. The world offers tacit tolerances for neglect, for the invisibility of some citizens, and I preyed on those quiet permissions, where communities are fragmented, where social safety nets fail, and where some people are isolated, the risk increases for predatory acts. This is not to blame society. It is to point out that predators exploit cracks. Understanding that helps law enforcement and social services identify vulnerabilities. It does nothing to alter my guilt, but it might prevent future selections by others. Finally, I want to speak about the list itself, the mental ledger I kept. The list was not always a literal list written on paper. Sometimes it was a sequence of ideas, a mental ranking that whispered, "This one next." The act of creating a list objectified people. It allowed me to think of them as items that could be crossed off. This is perhaps the most monstrous part of selection, reducing entire human beings to check marks. It made the decision to act mechanical. It turned life into a task and death into a completion. In confession, I cannot omit that truth. I catalogued, I labeled, I rationalized. I practiced approaches and learned what worked. I told myself stories to quiet conscience. I relied on social invisibility. I permitted the idea of inevitability to take root. None of this makes me less guilty. If anything, it makes the portrait grimmer. Not a single reckless moment, but a pattern of calculated choices, all justified inside a mind that had long ago been trained to undervalue other human beings. If anyone wants to prevent such crimes, they must understand the selection logic. They must see how isolation, labels, and small rationalizations become a ladder to atrocity. They must listen when someone speaks of dehumanizing language in their community, when someone is marginalized, and when odd obsessions are dismissed instead of addressed. That is what my confession offers beyond admission, a window into the cognitive processes that convert a thought into a pattern of selection and action. In closing this part of my confession, I repeat the fundamental truth. I chose. No external force forced my hand. No unavoidable destiny compelled me. I acted with a malice that hid behind method. The selections I made were the products of a corrupted calculus, a heart numbed by rationalization, and a mind sharpened by habit. I accept the full moral weight of those choices. I have catalogued every inch of my guilt in the cold light of my own scrutiny, and I carry it now into this courtroom, unshielded and unrepentantly truthful about the methods by which I turned people into marks, and marks into memories. When I stand here and admit to what I did, people expect horror in the form of blood and violence, but that was never the way I experienced it. To me, the acts themselves were not explosions of rage or blind destruction. They were rehearsed, deliberate, ritualistic. They followed patterns that gave me a sense of order, a rhythm to what should never have been done. My crimes were not the chaos of a storm, but the precision of a ceremony. The rituals mattered because they allowed me to mask my actions as something more than what they were. Without them, I might have seen too clearly that I was only killing. With them, I convinced myself that I was performing something inevitable, controlled, and almost sacred to my twisted mind. Before each act, there was a preparation stage that was as important to me as the act itself. I would create an environment where I could feel in command. The room organized in a particular way, items placed where I wanted them, the silence heavy. It was not about comfort, it was about control. Control of space precedes control of people. That is a truth I discovered early, and I made sure every detail signaled to me that this was my territory, my domain, where the rules were mine to dictate. In this atmosphere, the victim was already diminished in my mind before anything happened. They were entering a world I had prepared, a stage where I was both director and actor. Once the victim was there, I did not rush. The rituals began with small gestures of apparent normalcy, a drink offered, a seat indicated, a calm voice to lull them into thinking they were safe. This was not kindness. It was choreography. I derived satisfaction from seeing how easily trust could be manufactured, how quickly defenses could be lowered. There is something chilling in realizing how fragile the perception of safety can be, and I used that fragility as a tool. In these moments, I felt almost like a magician performing an illusion. I held the secret of what was to come, while they believed only in the surface reality I presented. When control shifted fully to me, the rituals changed. At this stage, I entered what I can only describe as a trance of detachment. The human being before me was no longer perceived as equal or autonomous. They were redefined in my mind as an object, a possession, a subject for my rituals. This cognitive distortion, turning human into thing, was essential. It silenced conscience. It allowed my hands to move without shaking, my voice to remain steady. I could look at a living person and convince myself I was working with material, not with a life. The acts themselves had variations, but always they were built around the same themes: dominance, immobilization, and transformation. Dominance was established first, whether by physical means or by substances that reduced resistance. Immobilization was critical because struggle disrupted the ritual. I wanted stillness, silence, a body that no longer asserted will. In that stillness, I felt an artificial peace, as though the chaos inside me had been momentarily quieted. Transformation came last, and it was psychological as much as physical. In my mind, I turned them from strangers into artifacts, from unpredictable beings into controlled objects. This was the perverse logic that made the act bearable, that I was shaping reality into something stable, unchanging, submissive to my will. It is difficult to explain the sensation of ritual without sounding as though I am dressing up cruelty in ceremonial language, but that is how I experienced it. I arranged sequences. I repeated steps in the same order. I created routines not because they were necessary, but because they gave me structure. A particular way of binding, a specific gesture repeated, a pattern of silence afterward. These were my rituals. They reassured me that I was not simply acting on impulse, but following a script. In truth, the script was only mine, written by a mind desperate to control what it could not control inside itself. During the acts, my psychology shifted in predictable phases. Beforehand, there was anticipation, a tension almost unbearable. During, there was detachment, a numbing, as though I observed myself from outside. Afterward, there was a strange calm, followed by the return of shame and fear. The calm came because the ritual was complete, the compulsion satisfied, but calm never lasted. Shame crept in, but even that was distorted. I did not feel shame for the pain I caused. I felt shame for being seen, for risking exposure, for not hiding well enough. Fear was not fear of morality. It was fear of capture. That is the ugliest truth. My emotions were centered not on the lives I destroyed, but on my own preservation. I must speak about the objects I kept, because they were part of the ritual as well. Possessions, fragments, reminders. They were trophies in one sense, but in another, they were anchors. They allowed me to revisit the sense of control long after the act was finished. A lock of hair, a piece of clothing, sometimes more disturbing remnants. Each one froze a moment in time and allowed me to feel again what I felt in the ritual. To the world, these objects were grotesque evidence. To me, in those moments, they were tokens of power, reassurance that the act had not dissolved into nothingness, but left a trace I could hold. Hiding the evidence was part of the ritual too. Disposal was not just a necessity to avoid capture. It was a ceremony of erasure. I performed it carefully, methodically, as though cleaning the stage after a performance. Every wipe, every concealment was a way of restoring the illusion of normalcy. The ordinary world did not know what had happened, and that ignorance was a form of power for me. Secrecy itself became addictive. The ability to carry on as if nothing had occurred fed the delusion that I was in control of my double life. After each act, my psychology fractured further. There was relief, but also hunger. The relief came from completing the ritual. The hunger grew from knowing it could be repeated. Each cycle deepened the compulsion, made the next act seem not only possible, but inevitable. The rituals became addictive, and like any addiction, they escalated. Repetition dulled the intensity, and to feel the same satisfaction, I sought stronger measures, more elaborate routines, greater risks. What began as experimentation hardened into pattern, and pattern into obsession. Looking back now, the most terrifying aspect is how ordinary the rituals felt at the time. They were woven into my life so seamlessly that I could go from one world to another without pause, from ritualized violence to casual conversation, from secrecy to public politeness. That compartmentalization is what allowed me to continue. Without rituals, without the careful structure I imposed, I might have faltered. With them, I sustained the illusion of order and inevitability. I must stress again that these were choices. Ritual does not absolve me. It damns me further, because it shows how much thought and preparation went into what I did. I cannot claim momentary insanity or blind rage. I built these acts brick by brick, step by step, until they stood like monuments to my obsession. Each ritual was deliberate, each detail chosen. I did not stumble into horror. I constructed it methodically, and I lived inside it as though it were a temple of my own design. That is the truth of the acts themselves, not random, not impulsive, but ritualized and controlled. A man convincing himself of mastery when in fact he was enslaved by compulsion. A man reducing human beings to objects in order to silence his own conscience. A man so invested in secrecy and ritual that he mistook destruction for creation, violence for order, cruelty for control. And I stand here now to admit it fully. The rituals did not elevate what I did. They only masked it from me. Beneath the patterns and the control, it was still murder. Beneath the detachment and the trophies, it was still cruelty. I cannot undo the acts, and I cannot cleanse them with explanation. But I can expose them for what they were, rituals of control that left nothing behind but broken lives, and a hollow man who mistook compulsion for destiny. When I stand before you now, I do not deny what I have done. The record speaks for itself. The evidence, the testimonies, the confessions, they all align to form a portrait that no amount of denial could erase. I killed. I took lives that were not mine to take, and in doing so, I shattered families, ended futures, and violated the most fundamental law of existence, the right of another human being to live. I admit this. I do not seek to cover it in excuses, and yet, when I try to speak of it, when I attempt to explain how I came to that abyss, I cannot avoid the instinct to reach for reasons, for frameworks that make the unbearable at least intelligible. If that is rationalization, then it is because I am still human enough to seek meaning in destruction. I grew up in an environment that warped me long before I had the language to describe the warping. Violence was not an exception. It was the background noise of my childhood. My earliest memories are not of warmth or safety, but of volatility. Voices raised to the pitch of breaking glass, hands that struck before words could mediate. The constant lesson that dominance was the only defense against being dominated. In such a world, compassion seemed like weakness, and survival meant hardening yourself before others could break you. This does not absolve me, but it planted seeds, seeds of distortion, seeds of hunger, seeds of belief that the world was a battlefield where only the ruthless survived. As I grew older, I began to construct a framework, a system of thought that justified my alienation. When others spoke of love, community, or empathy, it sounded like a foreign language to me. My life had trained me to interpret kindness as deceit and vulnerability as danger. And so I told myself a story, that human beings are not sacred, that they are fragile vessels, that beneath the surface, everyone hides rot and betrayal. Killing then became not an abomination, but a revelation, a stripping away of illusions, a brutal confirmation of what I had always suspected. This is the rationalization I clung to, that I was not destroying, but exposing, that I was not murdering, but unmasking. When I looked at my victims, I told myself I was confronting the truth of mortality, proving that control belongs not to laws or morals, but to the one who dares to act. In those moments, I felt like I was tearing through the fabric of lies society drapes over death. I convinced myself that I was a kind of messenger, though the message was twisted. Life is fragile, and I alone had the will to prove it. But distortion does not end there. Another part of me believed I was, in some contorted way, balancing scales. I remembered the helplessness of my own past, the nights of fear, the humiliations, the sense that I was prey in a world of predators. Each act of violence felt like an inversion. No longer prey, I became predator. No longer powerless, I became the arbiter. The victim became a stand-in, not for who they truly were, but for the faceless oppressors of my memory. That is not justice, and I know it. But inside my mind, it felt like reclamation. I even told myself there was structure, almost a ritualistic necessity, in what I did. I convinced myself that each act was not random, but part of an internal order I alone could see. That delusion granted me a sense of purpose, even grandeur. I painted myself as a figure carrying out a grim task, as though fate had bent me toward violence, and to resist it would be to deny destiny. This is perhaps the most dangerous rationalization of all, to mistake compulsion for calling, to reframe obsession as purpose. Looking back now, from the vantage point of exposure and consequence, I can see the layers of deceit I wove around myself. But I must admit, even here, that part of me still reaches for those rationalizations. To accept unfiltered guilt is to stare into a void so vast that it threatens to consume what remains of me. And so I find myself saying, yes, I was wrong, monstrously wrong, but here is why I did it. Here is how I believed it made sense at the time. I offer these explanations not to erase the horror, but because without them I am left only with chaos, and chaos terrifies me more than punishment. If I had been different, if I'd been raised in a home where love outweighed fear, would I be standing here now? I cannot know, but I cannot help but believe that the path was carved into me long before I chose to walk it. I did not wake one day and decide to become a killer. I became one through layers of injury, distortion, and surrender to impulses that felt inevitable. That is not exoneration, it is context. Yet I cling to context the way a drowning man clings to driftwood. There is another rationalization I cannot avoid, the belief that part of me sought punishment all along. Some of the risks I took, some of the carelessness I allowed, they were not accidents. They were signals, subconscious cries for the cycle to end. In that sense, even my arrest becomes part of the narrative I built, a final act of exposure, the unmasking of the one who once believed he was the unmasker. If that is self-serving, then so be it. But it feels, at least, like coherence in a life defined by fracture. So I confess. I confess not only to the acts themselves, but to the rationalizations that accompanied them. I admit I was wrong, and I admit that I sought to justify my wrongs with illusions. I admit that I twisted pain into purpose, trauma into destiny, fear into control. I admit that I mistook compulsion for will and hunger for truth. These admissions do not bring back the lives I took. They do not heal the wounds I inflicted on families and communities. They do not erase the terror I unleashed, but they are the only honesty I can offer, that I was not only guilty, but self-deceived, that I built a cage of rationalizations and then mistook it for freedom. Perhaps you will hear these words as cowardice, as another attempt to deflect responsibility. I will not argue against that. Perhaps they are, but I also know that without speaking them, without laying bare the distorted beliefs that fueled me, my confession would remain incomplete. For what I did was not just killing, it was living inside a system of thought that permitted killing. To confess only the acts is to confess half the truth. The full truth requires unveiling the warped logic that sustained me. And so here it is, my attempt at rationalization, my admission that even in guilt, I seek patterns, reasons, and frames that make the unbearable slightly less unbearable. That is who I am, even now. A man who killed, a man who was wrong, a man who cannot stop trying to make sense of the senseless, even if the sense I create is as twisted as the acts I committed. That is all I have. When I stand here, at the end of everything that has unfolded, I understand there is no use in circling around the truth anymore. I have given you fragments of how I came to be, of the twisted beliefs I carried, of the delusions I nurtured to make my actions bearable in my own mind. I spoke of background, of influences, of choices disguised as compulsions. But those words, those rationalizations, those attempts to connect dots between pain and destruction, they are finished. This is not the place for justification anymore. This is the place for the stark fact of what I am, of what I have done, of what cannot be undone. I killed. That is the first and last truth. Everything else I have said, every attempt to analyze or explain, is secondary to this. I ended lives deliberately, repeatedly, with full awareness of what I was doing. I exercised control over others in the most absolute way possible, by extinguishing them. And once extinguished, they are gone forever, reduced to memories for their families and to burdens on this record. I did that. I am the cause. No one else. I do not come here to beg. I do not come here to weep. I do not come here to craft illusions of redemption. Those things have no meaning anymore. What would an apology accomplish? Words cannot rebuild flesh, cannot breathe air back into lungs, cannot repair the futures I erased. Even if I cried oceans of tears, they would be hollow, because they would be about me trying to cleanse myself, not about undoing the damage, and the damage is permanent. It is final. My actions guaranteed that. So I will not tell you I am sorry. I will not ask you to forgive. I will not insult you with words that cannot reach the depth of destruction I caused. What I can do, and the only thing left within my control, is to stand here and accept that I am guilty. Not guilty with caveats, not guilty with footnotes, not guilty with stories attached, but guilty, naked, and entire. I chose to do what I did. I could have resisted, but I did not. I wanted what I wanted, and I acted. That is guilt in its purest form. There is a temptation in every human being to imagine themselves as something more than the sum of their crimes, to cling to some shred of identity that softens the blow of their deeds. I feel that temptation too, but I reject it now. When I weigh what I have done, the truth is that my crimes are not an aspect of me. They are me. They define the pattern of my existence. To speak of myself apart from them is to lie. The murders are not footnotes in my story. They are the story. And the man who tells you otherwise is still trying to escape. You might wonder if I feel regret. The honest answer is more complicated than a simple yes or no. I do not feel remorse in the way you might expect. I do not sit awake at night with tears soaking the pillow, haunted by the faces of those I killed. That would be a lie if I said so. What I feel instead is the cold weight of inevitability. I see the sequence of my life laid out like a line of dominoes, one falling into the next, until the last one toppled into blood. I feel recognition, not sorrow. I feel acceptance, not repentance. If I were given the chance to return to freedom, I cannot stand here and promise you that I would live differently. The compulsion in me was not an accident, not a temporary fever. It was part of the structure of my being. I see that now with more clarity than ever. To live freely would be to live with that compulsion still inside me, waiting for the right circumstance to awaken again. I do not lie to myself about that. If the door were opened, the cycle could return. That is why prison is not only punishment for me, it is containment, a necessary boundary to stop what I am from repeating itself in the world outside. Death itself does not frighten me. If execution is what the state decides, then execution is what I will face. But I do not pretend that it will balance scales. Taking my life will not restore what I have destroyed. It will not erase the suffering of families. It will not undo the nights of terror, the unanswered questions, the holes carved into the lives of others. It will simply end me, remove me from circulation, make sure I cannot act again. And perhaps that is enough. Perhaps that is all justice can accomplish. Not repair, but prevention. As I reflect now, I see the emptiness of all my previous attempts at meaning. I once told myself I was revealing truths, unmasking mortality, asserting control. But in the end, There is nothing profound in what I did. There is no philosophy in killing. There is only silence, absence, and ruin. I might have dressed it up in words and rituals, but stripped bare, it was just destruction. I cannot even elevate myself with illusions of purpose anymore. I was not a prophet of death. I was not an agent of truth. I was simply a murderer, clinging to self-made myths to make myself believe I was more than what I was. This is what remains, a man stripped of illusions, reduced to his acts. And those acts are unforgivable, not because forgiveness is withheld, but because forgiveness has no meaning in the face of permanence. You cannot forgive someone for erasing the irreplaceable. You can only endure it, and carry it, and live with the wound. That is what I leave behind to the families. They carry the consequences. I carry the guilt. The two will never reconcile. I will not ask this court to show me mercy. Mercy is for those who can change, for those who can return something to the world by being spared. I have nothing to return. Whatever humanity I might once have had was squandered in the acts I committed. To keep me alive is only to preserve a reminder of what I was capable of. To end me is to erase a presence that has already poisoned too much. Either way, I accept. I do not resist judgment. I do not bargain. I do not beg. This is my final reflection. I am guilty. I am the sum of my murders. I am the architect of suffering. I am not misunderstood, not mistreated, not misjudged. I am exactly what I appear to be, a killer whose choices demand consequence. That consequence will come, whether through a cell, a needle, or the grinding passage of time. And when it comes, I will not flinch, because I have already faced the truth. There is no redemption waiting for me. There is no story of transformation, no arc of salvation. There is only the end, and the recognition that it is deserved. If there is anything I have left to give, it is this confession, not to excuse, not to soften, but to state clearly and without disguise. I did it. I knew what I was doing. I accept what follows. That is all.